Thank you so much, Detroit Board, for allowing me this opportunity to present to you the results of an analysis that Karen Twomey and I conducted as part of our work with the Detroit Data and Democracy Project. Thank you, audience members, as well. I'll go through this sort of quickly, and if you have questions, I'll be here to answer them. So as everyone knows, but just to make sure our audience is aware as well, on March 30th, 2015, the Coalition for the Future of Detroit Children delivered what was a much anticipated set of recommendations for Detroit schools, and that included DPS, but also the EAA and the charter schools that are located in the city of Detroit. Presented those to the governor, and because those recommendations received a great deal of attention, both locally in the media and even in the national press, in the New York Times and elsewhere, we thought it would be valuable to pay some attention to them and to try to discern their merits, and also some cautions to be raised as well. I also want to note that Lamar Lemons played an important role in the coalition as well, and has been great at bringing information back to this body, and I know we appreciate that. So those brief media accounts, what they often seem to do is pick up just a headline or two. So what we would read is things like, the coalition wants to return power to the Detroit Board of Education. The coalition recommends that Governor Snyder fold the EAA schools back into the DPS. And many of us who have been following these issues for quite some time and who value local governance and believe that a city that is 82% or 83% African American should also have the right to self-governance over its schools, many of us were encouraged by those recommendations and viewed the announcements as good news. And there were some positives, we have to admit, in the coalition report. But when we started to look more carefully at some of the specific items that the press was reporting on uncritically, what we actually discovered is that there were some limitations, and those limitations are quite serious. So in our initial response, we do want to note both areas of strength in the coalition report as well as some important concerns. And we're doing a larger project of analysis in which we're looking at 4 areas: governance and accountability, financial sustainability, academics, and equity. But what I'm going to speak to tonight is mainly on the first, which is related to governance and accountability, and then I'll be sharing briefly the scores of the report's card grades that we gave to the coalition on each of its 8 recommendations. So we agree that effective governance and accountability mechanisms are the foundation of any sustained improvement in academics, fiscal health, and assurance of equity. And we do applaud the coalition's recognition that top-down systems of governance over Detroit schools in recent decades, during the first state takeover from 1996 to 2006, and then again from 2009 to 2015, that they've created and exacerbated fiscal woes while failing to deliver meaningful academic improvement. We were happy to see the coalition recognize that, both in its written report and in some of its public statements at the time of the release of the report. We're also pleased with the coalition's calls, which are backed, mind you, by a lot of research evidence that would lead us to believe that the end of emergency management by the state and the restoration of democratic accountability through the empowerment of the elected Detroit Board of Education were the best things to do if what was desired was to keep to the wishes of the Detroit electorate and do what's best for the school children of Detroit, whether they're in Detroit public schools or not. However, our close review of some of the coalition's other recommendations, beyond the returning to DPS, the power to the Detroit Board, leaves us with uncertainty as to the extent to which the Detroit Board can actually be expected to govern, and by extension be held accountable by the electorate. Most of the core powers that are reserved for an elected board in other public school districts across the state, which I want to note are all, those districts are almost all majority white, are subsumed in the coalition proposal by a new mayorally appointed Detroit Education Commission, or DEC. In almost all Michigan public school districts, an elected board, and not an appointed education commission, exercises its authority on behalf of the electorate in 5 main areas. And this is where where Ms. Twomey's expertise as an elected board member and as someone who works with the National Association of School Boards and the Michigan Association of School Boards her research, those 5 main areas include the adoption and implementation of a new budget, the hiring and supervision of a superintendent, the negotiation and management of collective bargaining agreements, the establishment through consultation with the community of a vision and goals for the district, and finally the implementation of goals through effective policy. Those are all important powers that are bestowed to elected school boards. For example, to successful, predominantly white school boards in places like the Hills. But we were a little disturbed as we read deeper into the coalition report, again the 28-page report, that while calling for a return to democratic accountability, the coalition simultaneously removed key tools related to effective budgeting and planning from the elected boards, this body's toolkit. So particularly in Detroit's current environment of declining enrollment and shifting demographics, the power to close programs and open new ones is an essential component of righting the district's fiscal ship. There are many reasons why an elected board would want to consider closing the school, like dwindling enrollment or poor academic performance, the condition of the school building, and so on, or open a new one. So, for example, create new specialty schools to expand parental choice and draw in more families, to respond to innovations in education delivery and classroom best practices, to offer true bilingual schools, and so on. So the coalition calls for that power, for that specific power about openings and closings to be vested in this new bureaucratic layer, the Detroit Education Commission. It furthermore proposes that the DEC, the Detroit Education Coalition, in partnership with new regional councils, be empowered to decide when individual schools merit increased autonomy over their curriculum and programming. And we question whether the DEC will have the necessary capacity and expertise to decide when a school merits greater autonomy or closure. If it's created as a lean body of appointed volunteers, as the coalition proposal envisions in its text, then it's unlikely to possess the market research capacity or the academic expertise to know when to close buildings or grant individual schools greater curricular autonomy. The DEC could hire the professional personnel to build its capacity to make informed decisions, but the considerable cost that's associated with the creation of such a professional bureaucracy would be borne in part by the further usurping of scarce per pupil dollars in an already deeply financially struggling district. A new level of professional bureaucracy located in the DEC would also replicate the expertise that the Detroit community already finances within the DPS administration, now controlled by the emergency manager, and within Wayne RESA. And most importantly, the DEC would remove significant building level authority from the Detroit board, diminishing the ability of Detroit's electorate to hold elected Detroit board members accountable. So the report says we want to hold the Detroit Board of Education accountable for results while not giving it the power to, enough of the power to be able to create the conditions in which it could be accountable to the voters if it so chose to be. The elected board's capacity to control and be held accountable for its budgeting and programming is furthermore compromised by the proposed usurpation by the DEC of the managerial power of the elected board to negotiate collective bargaining agreements with the DPS workforce. That goes to the DEC as well. Class size targets and other aspects of classroom life that directly impact students and the conditions within which students learn are commonly negotiated in collective bargaining agreements, meaning that the delegation of this power, collective bargaining, to the DEC instead of the Detroit board will further impair the board's ability to establish a vision and set its own course. So with the coalition's recommendation that the DEC assume significant control over budgeting, collective bargaining, and the curricular decisions normally made by an elected board in consultation with its chosen superintendent, we concluded in this portion of our analysis that the coalition report promises the restoration of the elected board's power and accountability while leaving it with little of the substantive authority which Detroit's electorate rightly expects. So despite the coalition's familiarity with the significant body of research evidence supporting elected board efficacy, and I know they received that evidence because Ms. Twomey and I delivered to them personally, and also defending the prevalence of democratic accountability in all successful public school districts across the state of Michigan, the coalition's recommendations still restore almost none of the elected board's powers. Sadly, although the coalition report concludes correctly that top-down, non-democratic educational decision-making has damaged Detroit schools, it fails to deliver on the promise to restore democratic accountability. And what I want to do just in closing is share some of the other grades that we gave to the report, because we did give some positive grades as well. And these are areas that we'll be developing more of our analysis as we continue. So we gave them a D on returning the governance of Detroit Public Schools to an elected school board for the reasons that I just outlined. We gave them a C on charter authorizing to charter school boards, improving transparency and focusing more on quality and better coordination of all charter schools. And we did that because although we support those recommendations of transparency and accountability for charter schools, the mechanism of accomplishing those recommendations was still unclear in the document and was likely to be contested by especially the private for-profit organizations that are involved with many of our charters. We did give a very good grade to the coalition report for stating as its third recommendation that the state should assume the DPS debt. We gave them an A+. We do believe that very strongly, and we were very encouraged to see John Racolta of none other than Walbridge Construction Company say in live broadcast on TV press release that the state is responsible entirely for the DPS debt. That's encouraging. That used to be only something that those of us who would be labeled as conspiracy theorists, we certainly could never get that idea into our press. So to have someone of such power and prestige be saying that, I'm editorializing a little bit, but I was wondering, where was the Free Press or the Detroit News to stop him from saying that? This radical statement that the state, which is actually borne out by looking at the actual data, that it was the state that's responsible. So we did give an A+ to the coalition report for that, and we do hope that the state recognizes its responsibility. And the correct term is not forgive the debt, right? It's we who need to be asked to forgive the state, right? And maybe we'll let the board decide if they'll do that, but it seems like there's a lot of things that need to be done before that forgiveness will come. On creating this new nonpartisan entity, the DEC, we gave that an E, and which when I grew up was called an F. And we did that because this new body that is appointed by the mayor will only be accountable to the mayor, right? Because the mayor will decide who to cancel if they step out of line. And if we have a mayor in power who we think has the best interests of Detroiters, well, that'll be a good thing. But if we're questionable about whose interests that mayor serves, then I'm less sure. We'd rather see, we know from the research evidence that it's better for that accountability to be shown to an elected board, like a board of education, like this body, which works quite well, again, in places like Bloomington Hills and in Ann Arbor, where closer to my home.
In Livonia.
Yeah, and Livonia, where the mayor comes from. Great point. So we gave a B over the idea of establishing school leadership teams that include parents, staff, and students. A B, we thought that's obviously very important for the community and the staff of the school to be involved in decision making, absolutely essential. We gave it a B only because we thought that it was redundant, because that is already required under the school improvement process, so we're not sure why it was included in the recommendation. We assume the coalition supports that all laws be enforced. As far as fully funding, empower and fund the state reform office and reform district, which was recommendation number 7, we gave that an E, or it was an F when I grew up. We were disturbed by this because while it was presented as a dissolution, a dissolving of the EAA, this proposal actually relocates the EAA into the state reform office, which is now under Governor Snyder, and sets the ground for the EAA's statewide expansion. And this is something which the legislature rejected in December 2012 after quite a struggle during lame duck. That was the agenda, and it was not passed. And this seems like a means of accomplishing that through other means. So this is actually not a dissolution of the EAA. It's returning an EAA to the dream of Eli Broad and those who favored it so strongly. Even the schools that they say are to return to the DPS, they mean along already established guidelines. Well, the already established guidelines for returning those schools to the DPS, if I've read it correctly, is that after a period of 5 years of success, then the schools can be returned. We see no evidence that those schools are being lifted out of the bottom 5%. Quite the contrary, there have been more declines than increases. So we're not sure that the language adds anything here when it calls for the dissolution of the EAA and the return of those schools to the Detroit Public Schools. And then the final point is create shared systems of data enrollment and neighborhood transportation. And we also gave this an F based on a review of the research and the empirical data, or an E, because although it's very appealing, and we all know that because of the massive fragmentation, the idea of coordinating enrollment or coordinating transportation seems appealing. The evidence that we've seen from places where this has been tried, like Newark, New Orleans, and other cities, shows that this model creates additional costly bureaucracy, just like the DEC will. And whenever you create more bureaucracy, that's more of that per pupil that comes out that should be going to our students and into instruction. We know that in emergency management, we've seen so much taken out of classroom instruction. We're a laughing stock compared to the rest of the state in that we, in our current budgeting process, only put 43% into classroom instruction, whereas the state average is between 55 and 60, which is where it was in the Detroit public schools before the Board of Education was taken out of power. I think it's important for people to always remember that. So while the concept's appealing, it creates new bureaucracy, and it's also failed to bring the promised choice to families, right? So it sounds nice, we'll take you to any school you want all across the city, but what has happened in cities where that's been tried is there was a lottery system, and while some people will win the lottery and get exactly the school that they wanted, other parents end up not only being able to not choose their neighborhood school, but end up in a school that is no better than their neighborhood school, and is a long bus ride away. So it's a plan that serves charter entities well. Remember that most charters do not currently have their transportation paid for. And what this does sort of backdoor is provide lots of infrastructure for charter schools, because if we were to truly restore power to the Detroit board, the Detroit public schools would become quite competitive. And we need to do things to, in that view, to subsidize the charter schools more by the state to help make sure that they keep being profitable the way that they have been. Not only, I can also imagine that if, or we can also imagine that if charters in Detroit were given all of the subsidy for transportation to bring students from any point in the city to any other point in the city, and think about how complex of a web of transportation that is, then what it means is you'll soon have charter entities outside of Detroit saying, well, they can get that in Detroit, why can't we get that out here too? And so I think it's a way of a backdoor route to a sort of voucher world where that further dismantles our public schools, and obviously we don't favor that. So I'll stop there. I agree also that there are important differences, right? We did not have Excellent Schools Detroit Coalition calling for the dissolution of the debt. And we did not have any sort of emphasis on the creation of new methods of accountability within the schools through parent and teacher and staff involvement. So I think that that is a testament to some of what Lamar and others were able to accomplish by being there. And it's a good day when John Ricolta sounds